Yo, what's going on? Today I really want to talk about my first impressions or intros into the app Procreate, because I just got my iPad a couple of weeks ago and I've been sort of diving into it. There's a lot of difference between the digital world and the traditional world, so I want to really talk about the difference or the intros when it comes to a traditional artist getting into the digital space, especially with Procreate. I'm actually using Procreate for 3 different reasons. The first is that I do a lot of work with commercial clients, agencies, advertisers, developers. For the most part, they don't want a sort of physical painting. They just want a digital file that they can use on sort of the digital assets or the sort of all the Facebook or social media stuff that they're using. So for me, it doesn't make sense to always do a physical painting. So I want to be able to really work with them efficiently, do something digitally and send it off to them. Number 2 is I want to experiment as much as possible. So I love doing mock-ups, I love doing sketches, and I want to work wherever I want to, sort of on a plane or, you know, sitting on a bus stop. I want to be able to create what I want to without any restriction. And number 3, I just want to learn a new skill. I've been sort of putting off getting into that digital space for a long time, mainly because I just didn't really have the time to do it. But now, because of these current pandemic times, I'm able to actually sit down and actually learn Procreate. So my first impression of Procreate and getting into the digital space is that I learned that specs matters, mainly because you're limited by the amount of RAM or memory you have on your iPad. The largest file a Procreate file can be is around 8,000 pixels by 8,000 pixels or 16,000 pixels by 4,000 pixels, which isn't much when you're sort of getting into sort of the print world. But if you're in the sort of the digital space and you're only using your work for sort of your website or something on social media, you should be fine. And if you have an older iPad, you're limited even more by the amount of layers you can have on a certain project if your file is 8,000 by 8,000 pixels. So you really want to see if you can upgrade your iPad to have more RAM or sort of more memory to sort of save all the projects that you're doing. One of the things that I really liked about Procreate when you first open it up is the organization of the files. You know, as a traditional artist that does a lot of physical work, you know, it's very different to have multiple projects, you know, in the same space at the same time that you're working on, because you can sort of get disorganized. But with Procreate, they have it to where a lot of that stuff is really managed to where you're able to work efficiently. So I really like that part of it because it makes me feel more efficient whenever I'm doing a project. And that will help manage your life. When you first open up a project or create a project, it's really easy to sort of create the file size that you want based off of the sort of the output that you need it for. So if you're printing or if you're just using it for social media, you're easily able to do that. Not only that, when you're starting a project, you're easily able to sort of put on sort of like these perspective grids or guide. Traditional artists, you would have to do that by hand. So this is a lot easier to have like a transparent background that gives you the idea of the perspective that you want. So one of the main differences between sort of the traditional world and Procreate are the brushes. And the brushes are really something you really have to get used to, mainly because when you're sort of doing things in the physical world, there are sort of big differences when it comes to the physicality, the sort of randomness, and the finality. The physicality is the idea of, you know, having a physical paint, the humidity around you, the sort of the tools that you're using to spread paint around. All those really are physical and sort of, you know, they're based off of the tools that you have at your disposal in the real world. Consistency of the paint, how old is the paint? Is the paint a good brand? Did you make your own paint? All these different sort of ideas when it comes to the physical sort of medium. Whereas in Procreate, you're able to create an infinite amount of brushes to do exactly what you want. And the power of those brushes comes in when you're able to really get into learning how to create custom brushes or your own brushes, or to tweak certain brushes to do exactly what you want. The randomness between the sort of traditional world and the digital world is huge, because in the physical world, whenever I spread paint around, I don't know exactly sometimes how it's going to look, especially if it's on a sort of more abstract sort of concept type of painting, whereas in Procreate, I'm able to know exactly what that brush is going to do. Because I'm using a ton of tools and sort of ways to spread paint around in the physical world, everything from squeegees to trowels to sort of, fire extinguishers at one point, it's very difficult to figure out how to get that same sort of texture when I'm using a trowel or a squeegee or even a credit card on a painting. How do I do that in Procreate? It's very difficult to sort of mimic a lot of the techniques that I do in the real world. And there's a huge difference in finality, or the idea of finality. In the traditional world, when I put down a brush stroke or some paint, it's almost final. There's ways to correct it or sort of undo it, but it's very difficult, so I have to know exactly what I'm doing or putting down before I do it. Whereas in the digital world, it's very easy to sort of undo a brush stroke. In Procreate, you're able to just undo a good hour's worth of painting just like that if you're not happy with the progress. And a huge difference when it comes to brushes is the idea that in Procreate, you're able to use brushes for not only putting down paint, but also smudging paint and erasing paint as well. So you're able to do a lot with that same sort of amount of brushes, whereas in the real world, I would never sort of have the opportunity to use that same brush stroke to get a texture by taking paint off of a canvas. And the last thing about brushes is that Procreate created an entire sort of economy when it comes to custom brushes. You're able to buy brushes from other individuals to do exactly what you want. There's sort of different websites where people have created whole entire brush packs for you to download and use in your projects. So I have actually downloaded a ton of Procreate brushes for different projects, mainly because I don't want to spend time having to figure out how to, make custom brushes all the time for every purpose that I need to. There's a whole economy or marketplace for that already. Another thing about Procreate is you have layers, and you're able to do, a project with 100 different layers, mainly because, you're able to create a layer for your line art, your shading, this color, that color, whatever you want to. You're able to create a ton of different layers and sort of take out a layer when you need to, add a layer when you need to, change up what a layer does in the blending mode. So there's a lot of things that you really can do when you have layers, whereas in the traditional world, all your layers are combined as you're sort of putting down the paint. So that idea of finality sort of plays into the layers as well, where you're able to sort of change things up even right before you finalize the painting, whereas in a sort of traditional world, you're hard pressed to sort of go back underneath tons of layers and actually change something. In Procreate, they also have different effects that you can use, which is something that you rarely have in the traditional world. You can do things like stains, sort of like changing the tint of a painting, but it's very rare that you have the opportunity to sort of warp a painting around. Whereas in Procreate, you're able to warp a bunch of stuff. You're able to change up the saturation, the brightness of a layer, change up the blending mode, have things sort of transparent. So you're able to do a lot more when it comes to the effects of different layers in Procreate as well. Lastly, when it comes to colors, that is one of the biggest differences that I see whenever I'm sort of transitioning from the traditional world to the digital world. When you're working with colors, you really have to know in the physical world how to use colors and how they mix well. You are limited by the amount of color you have. Not only that, you're limited by the amount of color you have access to. So a brand may not even make a certain type of color. You're also limited by your wallet. So colors cost. A spray paint can get up to $15 per can, especially if it's a foreign brand. I get my spray paint cans and usually they're about $5 to $7, but it can get really expensive whenever you're buying spray paint. So your colors are sometimes limited by the amount of money that you have. So when you're in the traditional world, you have a limited amount of colors to use and a limited amount of colors that you can afford. In Procreate, you have an infinite amount of colors to use and to make. You can even bring a photo into your Procreate project and sample colors just from that photo. So it's very easy to sort of create a color palette, an endless amount of colors for that color palette as well. So in Procreate, they have a number more ways for you to actually make your color palette. You know, you can use the color wheel, which a lot of people do, or you can actually put in a color number so that you can share your color palette with other people as well. So this is one of the biggest problems that I see with sort of the idea of infinite colors when it comes to sort of the digital world, especially Procreate, is that you can mock up something in Procreate, but it's very difficult to get that into the real world. So it's very easy to get wild and crazy. In Procreate, when you're trying to create compositions with wild and crazy colors, how do you get that into the real world? So transitioning between the two, those are some of the things that you really have to sort of look out for. And like I said, I think it's great for artists, traditional artists, to really get into sort of the Procreate and digital world. There's a lot of things like the brushes, the layers, the effects that are very different in terms of how you need to build up your composition and the process. So I had to sort of break my sort of process down and recreate it for the digital world. It's very difficult to figure out how to recreate a lot of the wild abstract that I do into the digital space. So I recommend for a lot of traditional artists to really experiment as much as they can by getting into Procreate. Get yourself an iPad, doesn't matter how old it is, as long as you're sort of starting out that process and really diving into it, because like I said, there's a big difference between the brushes that you use, the process. So breaking down your process in the sort of traditional realm and then figuring out how to recreate it in the digital realm. There's a lot of things that you can't do in both. They have pros and cons in both worlds, but it's very good to know exactly, you know, how to be sort of like an art ninja in both of these worlds, because, you know, things are becoming more digital, but you also want to still retain that traditional sort of way of painting as well. So I'll have a lot of the projects that I do in my Procreate posted on my YouTube channel. I'll show you the time lapse. So if you have any questions, definitely put it in the comment section. Like and subscribe. I'm trying to do more of these videos to share as much of my experience as an artist as possible. So definitely support by liking, subscribing, and sharing my videos.